April 11, 1945, 14:30. Ettersberg Hill, 5 miles northwest of Weimar, Germany. A cold wind swept across the barren ground outside the electrified fence, carrying the unmistakable scent of death. First Lieutenant Frederick Keffer of the 6th Armored Division, part of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, paused at the edge of the forest. His reconnaissance team had been advancing eastward from Gotha when reports came in of a large camp in this area. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The gates of Buchenwald concentration camp stood before them, and beyond those gates lay evidence of humanity's darkest capacity for cruelty. Inside were more than 21,000 prisoners, living skeletons with sunken eyes who had survived against impossible odds. They were the lucky ones. Since 1937, approximately 250,000 people had been imprisoned within these walls. At least 56,000 had perished from starvation, disease, execution, medical experimentation, and the relentless brutality of the SS guards. This is not a tale of supernatural monsters or fictional horrors. This is the documented story of what men did to other men, women, and children in a place designed to eliminate human dignity before eliminating human life itself. The horror lies not in invented terrors, but in the irrefutable historical record of what happened at Buchenwald in the final days before its liberation, and the courageous acts of resistance that helped save thousands of lives in the shadow of almost certain death. What follows is based exclusively on documented evidence. Testimonies of survivors, military records, and the accounts of the American liberators who arrived that spring afternoon to witness firsthand the evidence of mass atrocity. And the remarkable story of how the prisoners themselves rose up to seize control of the camp in the final hours before freedom arrived. January 1945. Buchenwald concentration camp. The winter of 1945 was unusually harsh in central Germany. Inside Buchenwald's perimeter, defined by electrified barbed wire fences, watchtowers with machine guns, and a chain of SS sentries, death had become industrialized. Established in 1937, the camp was never designated as an extermination center like Auschwitz, but death was nonetheless its most reliable product. Prisoner number 34721, a Polish political prisoner named Wisław, shuffled across the frozen Appellplatz, the camp's central roll call square. His wooden clogs scraped against the hard ground as he made his way toward Block 46. He'd been assigned to carry medical supplies, a task that brought him dangerously close to the camp's experimental ward. "Move faster!" an SS guard shouted, striking him across the shoulders with a truncheon. Wisław stumbled, but kept his footing. At 39 kilograms, his emaciated frame could ill afford another beating. He'd survived 3 years in this hell, watching thousands die around him. The Nazi camp system had methodically stripped away everything: his name, his dignity, his humanity, reducing him to a number and a classification. The red triangle on his uniform marked him as a political prisoner. Others wore different colors: yellow for Jews, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for homosexuals, black for those deemed asocial, green for criminals. As January began, the population of Buchenwald had swollen dramatically. The camp, designed to hold around 8,000 prisoners, now contained more than 80,000. The reason was clear to everyone inside. As the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east, the Nazis were evacuating other camps. Thousands of half-dead prisoners had been force-marched or transported by cattle cars to Buchenwald, from places like Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen. Wisław reached Block 46 and delivered his package to an SS medical officer. Inside this building, German doctors conducted experiments on live prisoners, intentionally infecting them with virulent diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever, to test vaccines and treatments. Hundreds had died in these studies. As he turned to leave, Wiesław caught sight of a group of new arrivals being processed at the camp entrance. They swayed on their feet, hollow-eyed and skeletal. Many would not survive their first week. The Little Camp, a section within Buchenwald set aside for new arrivals, had become the primary place of death, filth, and disease. Barracks built to house 400 men now held up to 1,800. Typhus was rampant, spreading unchecked through the overcrowded spaces. Yet even in this hell, there was resistance. Wiesław was part of it, a secret network of prisoners who had infiltrated key administrative positions within the camp. They worked to sabotage Nazi orders, divert food to the weakest inmates, and maintain lists of the SS officers responsible for the worst atrocities. They kept detailed records of everything they witnessed, preserving evidence for the day they prayed would come, when the world would see the truth of what had happened here. As night fell, Wiesław made his way to his barracks. The temperature dropped well below freezing, and the thin, striped uniform provided little protection against the cold. Many would not survive the night. But as he huddled for warmth among his fellow prisoners, whispers passed among them. The Americans were pushing eastward. The Russians were advancing from the other direction. Hope was dangerous in Buchenwald. Hope could break a man faster than despair. But that night, the whispers continued, carrying with them the faintest possibility that the nightmare might eventually end. February 1945, Block 66, the Little Camp, Buchenwald. In the farthest corner of Buchenwald's Little Camp, away from the main administrative area and the watchful eyes of most SS guards, stood Block 66. It looked identical to the other squalid barracks, a long wooden structure with no insulation against the bitter winter cold. But inside was something extraordinary. Nearly 600 Jewish children and teenagers from across Europe. Antonin Kalina, a Czech political prisoner who served as the block elder, had managed something nearly miraculous. Working with his deputy, Gustav Schiller, a Polish Jewish communist, he had created a sanctuary of sorts for these young prisoners. Both men were members of the camp's underground resistance. "No one enters without my permission," Kalina told an approaching SS officer, pointing to a sign he had placed on the door. Typhus outbreak. It was a calculated risk. The sign was both a deterrent and a plausible excuse. Typhus was indeed rampant throughout the camp. But Block 66 was relatively protected. Through an elaborate system of subterfuge, Kalina had registered most of these children as non-Jews, listing them instead as political prisoners to shield them from the worst of the Nazi persecution. Inside Block 66, 13-year-old Joseph from Prague huddled on his bunk. He had arrived 3 weeks earlier after surviving the death march from Auschwitz. Of the 60,000 prisoners who had started that march, thousands had died from exposure, exhaustion, or SS bullets before reaching Buchenwald. "When will we get food?" Joseph whispered to the older boy beside him. "Schiller will bring what he can," came the reply. "Try to sleep." Sleep was nearly impossible. The barracks were designed to hold around 100 people. Now more than 600 boys were crammed inside. They slept, packed together on wooden platforms stacked from floor to ceiling. Disease was rampant, and the stench of unwashed bodies, excrement, and rot filled the air. Yet compared to conditions elsewhere in the camp, these children were relatively fortunate. In the main section of Buchenwald, the SS continued their regular selections. Those too weak to work were either executed on the spot or transported to euthanasia centers like Bernburg, where they would be gassed. But in Block 66, Kalina and Schiller did everything possible to keep the children hidden from these selections. Some of the older boys were occasionally sent to clear rubble in nearby Weimar after Allied bombing raids, work details that provided rare opportunities to scavenge for food. The youngest children, some as young as 4, remained hidden entirely, their existence unknown to most of the camp authorities. That night, as temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero, 3 new children arrived at Block 66. They had been found hiding in one of the adult barracks. Jewish brothers from Hungary, the youngest only 7 years old. "Your names?" Kalina asked them quietly. "Weiss, David, Samuel, and Elias," the oldest boy whispered. Kalina shook his head. "Not anymore. From now on, you are Danik, Stefan, and Emil Kovacs. You are Slovaks, political prisoners. Remember this if anyone asks." "But we're Jewish," the middle brother said, confused. "Not here," Kalina said firmly. "Not if you want to live." He led them to a crowded platform where other children made room. The resistance had managed to smuggle in extra bread rations for the new arrivals, a small miracle in a place where starvation was policy. As February progressed, the sounds of distant artillery became more frequent. Something was changing beyond the camp's walls. The guards seemed agitated, destroying documents and preparing for what seemed inevitable. The Allied forces were getting closer. For the children of Block 66, salvation seemed tantalizingly close. If they could just survive a little longer. March 1945, Pathology Building, Buchenwald. The pathology building stood at the northern edge of the main camp. Here, behind walls that contained both a medical clinic and research laboratories, some of the most disturbing experiments of the Third Reich took place. SS doctors, working under the guise of scientific research, subjected prisoners to torturous procedures without anesthesia or consent. Dr. Werner Schmidt, an SS physician, made notes as he observed the progress of his latest typhus experiment. Before him lay prisoner number 29154, a 32-year-old Russian man who had been deliberately infected with the disease 2 weeks prior. The man's fever had reached 41 degrees Celsius. His body was covered in the characteristic rash, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. "Record time of death when it occurs," Schmidt instructed his assistant, another prisoner forced to assist with the medical experiments. "I want tissue samples preserved within 30 minutes. The assistant, a French doctor named Marcel, who had been arrested for treating resistance fighters, nodded silently. He had witnessed dozens of these deaths. Each one eroded another piece of his soul, but he maintained his position to gather evidence and occasionally, secretly, provide comfort to the victims. Since 1941, Buchenwald had been a center for medical experimentation. Tests for vaccines against typhus, typhoid, cholera, and diphtheria had resulted in hundreds of deaths. The SS also conducted phosphorus burn experiments, deliberately inflicting wounds on prisoners using material extracted from incendiary bombs to test treatments. In 1944, Danish physician Dr. Karl Vernet had begun a series of experiments claiming to cure homosexual inmates through artificial hormone implants. The procedures were failures, causing immense suffering without the promised results. Marcel moved between the 12 beds, each holding a prisoner in varying stages of disease progression. Their suffering was documented with clinical precision: temperature charts, symptom progression, organ function. The human beings behind the data were irrelevant to the SS doctors. In an adjacent laboratory, samples of human tissue, liver, kidney, brain, muscle, floated in formaldehyde-filled jars. Slides of blood and tissue samples lined the shelves. Death was not merely a byproduct of these experiments. It was often the intended endpoint, allowing for post-mortem examination. "Doctor, we have the new subjects ready," a German nurse announced from the doorway. Schmidt nodded. "Bring them in." 5 men were led into the room. They wore the standard striped uniforms of Buchenwald prisoners, but their bodies showed the extreme emaciation common throughout the camp. Each weighed less than 40 kilograms. Their heads had been shaved, and their eyes reflected the dull resignation of men who had witnessed too much horror to be shocked by anything more. "These will be for the new typhoid series," Schmidt explained. "Isolate them in Ward B and begin the baseline measurements." Marcel felt the familiar wave of nausea and suppressed rage. He had been documenting everything. Every experiment, every death, every name of both victims and perpetrators. The small notebook he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters contained evidence that would eventually help convict many of these doctors at the Nuremberg trials. As March continued, an increasing sense of urgency gripped the SS medical staff. Orders had come to destroy records and eliminate witnesses. Marcel observed the doctors burning files and removing evidence of the most incriminating experiments. That night, as he updated his secret records by candlelight, Marcel added a new observation. March 15, 1945. SS destroying documentation of phosphorus and hepatitis experiments. Dr. Schmidt ordered disposal of all remaining test subjects in Ward C. 17 men killed by phenol injection to heart. If the Allies arrived soon, Marcel's testimony and documentation would ensure that at least some of these crimes would not go unpunished. Early April 1945. Buchenwald and surrounding areas. The sound of distant artillery had become constant. Allied forces were approaching from the west, and the SS leadership at Buchenwald received orders from Berlin. Evacuate the camp and eliminate witnesses. On April 6, SS Hauptsturmführer Hermann Pister, the commandant of Buchenwald since 1942, ordered the first major evacuation. Thousands of prisoners were assembled on the Appellplatz, many too weak to stand without support. The selections were arbitrary and brutal. Those who appeared strongest would be forced to march away from the advancing Allies, while many of the weakest would be left behind to die or be executed. Jakob Rosenberg, a Polish Jewish prisoner who had survived 3 years in Buchenwald, stood in formation as SS guards moved through the ranks. Each guard carried a clipboard with lists of prisoner numbers, but the selections often ignored these lists entirely, driven instead by momentary whims. "You, and you, step forward," barked an SS officer, pointing at Jakob and 2 men beside him. Jakob shuffled forward, his wooden clogs scraping against the frozen ground. At 42 kilograms, he was a walking skeleton, his once muscular frame ravaged by years of starvation and forced labor. The prisoner beside him swayed unsteadily, clearly suffering from dysentery, one of the many diseases that ravage the camp's population. "Transport Group 3, the officer announced, making a notation on his clipboard. "You leave at dawn." As the selections continued throughout the day, the camp's underground resistance, a network of political prisoners who had managed to secure administrative positions, worked desperately to sabotage the evacuation efforts. They altered lists, hid vulnerable prisoners, and delayed transports through bureaucratic confusion. These acts of resistance saved countless lives but carried tremendous risk. Discovery meant immediate execution. The next morning, Jakob found himself among approximately 4,800 prisoners assembled near the camp gate. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light snow had fallen overnight. Many wore only the thin striped uniforms that provided no protection against the elements. Some had fashioned crude wrappings for their feet from scraps of cloth. Others marched barefoot. "Forward!" the command rang out, accompanied by the barking of SS guard dogs and the chambering of rifle rounds. Clear warnings of what awaited anyone who fell behind. The column shuffled through the gate and onto the road that led away from Buchenwald. SS guards flanked the prisoners, rifles ready. For the first hour, the pace was manageable, but as the route began to climb into the surrounding hills, prisoners began to falter. The first shooting occurred less than 2 hours into the march. An elderly French prisoner collapsed, unable to continue. Without hesitation, an SS guard approached, placed his rifle against the man's head, and fired. The body was left where it fell, and the column continued without breaking stride. This scene would repeat itself dozens of times over the coming hours. By midday, the road behind the marching column was marked by corpses at regular intervals, breadcrumbs of death marking their route. Jacob focused on placing one foot before the other, ignoring the searing pain in his frostbitten toes. He knew that to stop was to die. Beside him marched a Czech man named Petr, who had been in Buchenwald since 1941. "American tanks," Petr whispered, his voice barely audible. "They say the Americans are less than 50 kilometers away. If we can delay, find a way to slow the march." An SS guard overheard the whispers and struck Petr with his rifle butt, sending him sprawling into the muddy road. "No talking! Keep moving!" Petr struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his temple, and rejoined the column. The march continued. That day, April 7, nearly 4,800 prisoners were marched from Buchenwald. On April 10, approximately 9,000 more were evacuated. In total, about 28,000 prisoners were removed from the main camp and its subcamps during these evacuations, what survivors would later call the death marches. The routes took them eastward, away from the advancing American forces, and deeper into German-controlled territory. The prisoners had no knowledge of their destination. Many suspected they were being marched to their deaths, and these fears were justified. Of those evacuated from Buchenwald in April 1945, approximately one-third, roughly 8,000 human beings, died during these marches, either from exhaustion, exposure, starvation, or execution by their SS guards. Those who remained in Buchenwald waited in a state of terrible uncertainty, hearing rumors of the death marches, and knowing that they, too, might soon be forced to join them. But with each passing day, the sounds of battle grew closer, and with them, a dangerous flicker of hope. April 10 through 11, 1945, Buchenwald concentration camp. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 11, 1945, Walter Bartel moved carefully through the shadows of Buchenwald's administrative area. A German communist who had been imprisoned since 1939, Bartel had risen to a position of influence within the camp's prisoner administration. More importantly, he was the leader of the International Camp Committee, ICC, the secret resistance organization that had operated within Buchenwald for years. Tonight would determine whether their years of planning would save thousands of lives or lead to a final massacre. Intelligence gathered by the resistance was clear. American forces were now less than 15 kilometers from the camp. But the remaining SS guards had received orders to complete the evacuation and potentially execute those prisoners who couldn't be moved. Approximately 21,000 inmates remained in the camp, including nearly 1,000 children and teenagers. Bartel reached Block 1, where several other resistance leaders waited. The Russian Konstantin Leonov, the Frenchman Marcel Paul, and the Pole Zbigniew Lukasinski. Each represented national groups within the camp's underground network. "The last SS transport trucks are being prepared," Bartel informed them in a hushed voice. They plan to evacuate another 6,000 prisoners at dawn. "How many guards remain?" Leonov asked. "Fewer than 125, Bartel replied. "Most fled during the night. Those who remain are primarily focused on destroying evidence, burning files, dismantling the crematorium." The men exchanged glances. For years, they had worked meticulously to place trusted prisoners in key administrative positions throughout the camp. They had smuggled and hidden weapons, a few pistols and rifles taken from dead SS guards, improvised knives, clubs fashioned from table legs. Most crucially, they had built a network that spanned the entire camp, with representatives in every block who could mobilize their fellow prisoners when the moment came. "We move at 10, Bartel decided. "Spread the word through the block representatives. No one is to act until the signal." As dawn broke on April 11, the camp stirred to life for what would be its final day under Nazi control. At the main gate, SS guards assembled for roll call, their numbers noticeably diminished. Inside the barracks, prisoners prepared for morning appel, roll call, their movements mechanical after years of routine. At 10 a.m., a bell rang, the normal signal for prisoners to assemble for work assignments. But today, the plan was different. Block elders throughout the camp discreetly instructed prisoners to remain in their barracks. In the administrative buildings, resistance members who had positions as clerks began to delay and obstruct the evacuation preparations, misplacing transport lists and creating bureaucratic confusion. By noon, the camp was in a state of tense anticipation. SS guards, aware that something was amiss but unable to pinpoint the source of the disruption, grew increasingly agitated. Several prisoners were shot for minor infractions as the guards' nerves frayed. In Block 66, Antonin Kalina gathered the older children. "No matter what happens," he instructed them, "no one leaves this building until I give the order. Barricade the doors if necessary." At the camp's small radio room, officially used for SS communications but secretly accessed by the resistance, Guidon Damazin, a Polish engineer and radio technician imprisoned since 1941, and Konstantin Leonov prepared their most audacious act of resistance. Using a small transmitter and generator that had been assembled in secret and hidden in the prisoners' movie room, they prepared to send a message to the approaching Allied forces. At 1 p.m., Damazin transmitted in Morse code. "To the Allies, to the army of General Patton. This is the Buchenwald concentration camp. SOS. We request help. They want to evacuate us. The SS want to destroy us." The message was repeated several times in English, German, and Russian. There was no way to know if it had been received. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the first American tanks were spotted approaching the SS barracks area south of the main camp. The remaining SS officers immediately fled, abandoning their posts and the prisoners they had tormented for years. The moment had arrived. Throughout Buchenwald, the resistance network sprang into action. Hidden weapons were distributed. Prisoners who had been waiting for this day for years emerged to take control of key locations: the main gate, the watchtowers, the administrative buildings. By 3:15 p.m., armed prisoners had occupied the main watchtower and raised a white flag, a sign to the approaching American forces that the camp was no longer under SS control. The time, 3:15 p.m. on April 11, 1945, would later be memorialized as the official moment of Buchenwald's liberation, preserved on the clock at the camp's entrance gate, which remains fixed at that time to this day. Over the next hour, resistance fighters methodically searched the camp for remaining SS personnel. By 4 p.m., they had captured 76 SS men who had failed to escape. The prisoners' vengeance, after years of brutalization, was surprisingly restrained. The captured SS were held for the arriving American forces rather than summarily executed, a testament to the discipline maintained by the resistance leadership. At approximately 4:45 p.m., representatives of prisoners from 10 different nations gathered to form a provisional camp administration. A camp council was established, along with committees to address the most urgent needs: food distribution, medical care, and documentation of Nazi crimes. At 5 p.m., the first American scouts reached the main gate. Lieutenant Emmanuel Dessard and Sergeant Paul Bodo, Frenchmen serving with the 4th Armored Division. They were soon followed by Captain Frederic Keffer, Sergeant Herbert Gottschalk, Sergeant Harry Ward, and Private James Hoyt from the 6th Armored Division. These American soldiers were greeted by scenes that defied comprehension. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, many unable to stand without assistance. The dead still lying unburied. The evidence of mass murder visible in every direction. Buchenwald had been liberated through a remarkable cooperation between the prisoners' own resistance organization and the arriving American forces, freed from within and without. For the 21,000 survivors, including approximately 900 children and teenagers, April 11, 1945, marked the end of their captivity and the beginning of a long journey toward recovery. But the horrors they had witnessed and the evidence of crimes they had documented would ensure that the truth of Buchenwald would not be forgotten. April 11, 1945. 1710. Main Gate, Buchenwald. Captain Friedrich Keffer of the 6th Armored Division stood frozen at the main gate of Buchenwald, struggling to process the scene before him. Despite his combat experience across France and Germany, nothing had prepared him for this moment. "My God," whispered Sergeant Herbert Gottschalk beside him. "My God." Before them stretched a panorama of human suffering so extreme it seemed unreal. Thousands of prisoners, men reduced to skeletal figures in striped uniforms, gathered in the main square. Many were too weak to stand. Others approached the Americans slowly, as if afraid they were hallucinating. An emaciated man who identified himself as Colonel Brunet, a French resistance fighter captured in 1943, approached the American officers. "Welcome to Buchenwald," he said in halting English. "We have been waiting for you." He explained how the prisoners' resistance organization had seized control of the camp just hours earlier, after most of the SS guards had fled. The remaining Nazi personnel, 76 SS men, had been captured and were being held under guard. Keffer radioed his commanding officers. "This is Keffer. We found a concentration camp. Thousands of prisoners. SS guards captured by inmates. Request immediate medical assistance and supplies. The situation is... I can't describe it, sir. You need to see it." As Keffer's team moved deeper into the camp, the full scale of the horror became apparent. Near the crematorium stood stacks of corpses, hundreds of bodies in various stages of decomposition, piled like cordwood. Many showed signs of extreme starvation. Others bore the marks of violence. The crematorium itself contained the ashes of countless victims. In the camp infirmary, the Americans found scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Prisoners lay on bare wooden planks, their bodies ravaged by disease and starvation. Many were clearly dying, too far gone to be saved even with immediate medical intervention. Dr. James Reynolds, a medical officer with the 6th Armored Division who arrived shortly after the initial reconnaissance team, later described what he witnessed. "I've been a doctor for 20 years. I've seen death and suffering, but nothing like this. These weren't patients. They were living skeletons. Men with body weights of 30 kilograms or less, advanced starvation, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and the wounds, evidence of beatings, torture. It was beyond comprehension." Within hours of the Americans' arrival, military photographers and film crews were documenting the evidence. Edward R. Murrow, the legendary CBS radio correspondent, arrived on April 12th and broadcast his observations to the American public. "I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald," Murrow told his listeners. "I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words." The 6th Armored Division quickly established a command post and began organizing relief efforts. Their first priorities were providing food and medical care to the survivors, but this presented immediate challenges. "We can't just give them standard rations," Dr. Reynolds warned. "Their digestive systems can't handle normal food after prolonged starvation. We need specialized nutrition, administered carefully." Despite these precautions, many survivors died in the days immediately following liberation. Their bodies, pushed beyond endurance for years, simply couldn't recover. Between April 11th and May 1st, 1945, more than 400 liberated prisoners died at Buchenwald, despite receiving medical care. For the American soldiers, many of whom had fought across Europe since the Normandy landings, the liberation of Buchenwald was a transformative experience. Private James Hoyt, one of the first 4 Americans to enter the camp, rarely spoke about what he saw that day. Decades later, he would say only, "We were prepared for battle, not for this. No one could be prepared for this." Sergeant Harry Ward, who had seen fierce combat at the Battle of the Bulge, wrote in a letter home, "I thought I knew what we were fighting against. I was wrong. It's worse than anything I could have imagined. This isn't war, it's something else entirely." On April 16, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, ordered that as many American soldiers as possible should visit the liberated concentration camps. He also ordered that German civilians from the nearby town of Weimar be brought to witness the atrocities that had taken place just kilometers from their homes. "Get it all on record now," Eisenhower directed. "Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." As more American units arrived at Buchenwald, the 6th Armored Division continued its advance eastward, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had seen, and a renewed understanding of why they fought. April 12 to 15, 1945. Block 66, Buchenwald. The day after liberation, an American medical team entered Block 66 for the first time. What they found both horrified and moved them. Merely 1,000 children and teenagers, most Jewish, who had somehow survived the Nazi death machine through a combination of luck, resilience, and the protective efforts of the prisoner resistance. Captain Bernard Edelman, a Jewish-American Army physician, was among the first to examine the children. "Many showed signs of severe malnutrition," he reported. "Vitamin deficiencies, stunted growth. Almost all had some form of disease, tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery." 8-year-old Israel Meir Lau, who would later become the Chief Rabbi of Israel, was among the youngest survivors. He had been hidden and protected by his older brother and other prisoners. 4-year-old Josef Schleifstein, one of the youngest inmates of Buchenwald, had survived because his father had hidden him inside the camp, occasionally smuggling him into his workplace in a sack. Rabbi Herschel Schachter, a chaplain with the U.S. Third Army, arrived at Buchenwald on April 11 as one of the first Jewish chaplains to enter the camp. On April 15, he conducted a religious service for the surviving children, the first opportunity many had to openly practice their faith in years. "Children, you are free," Schachter told them, his voice breaking. Many of the children, traumatized by years of brutality and the constant threat of death, struggled to comprehend that their ordeal was truly over. Antonin Kalina, the Czech political prisoner who had protected the children of Block 66 throughout the final months of the camp's operation, continued to care for them during the chaotic days after liberation. His efforts, along with those of his deputy Gustav Schiller, had saved hundreds of young lives. In 2012, Kalina would be posthumously recognized as Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims, for his courageous actions. American medical teams worked tirelessly to address the children's immediate needs. Many required hospitalization for severe malnutrition and disease. Special feeding programs were established, providing liquid and soft foods that their weakened digestive systems could process. Clean clothing, the first many had worn in years, was distributed. Psychological trauma presented another layer of challenges. Many of the children had witnessed unimaginable horrors. They had seen family members murdered, endured constant abuse, and lived for years with the imminent threat of death. Some of the youngest had spent their entire conscious lives in concentration camps with no memory of normal existence. Despite these profound challenges, moments of renewed humanity emerged. American soldiers organized games for the children strong enough to participate. They brought toys, books, and art supplies. For many of the children, it was their first experience of kindness from adults in years. 16-year-old Elie Wiesel, who had been transferred to Buchenwald from Auschwitz with his father in January 1945, was among the survivors. His father had died in the camp just months before liberation. Wiesel would later become a renowned author, humanitarian, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, dedicating his life to ensuring the world would never forget the Holocaust. The story of Buchenwald's children represented both the darkest and most hopeful aspects of the camp's history. The Nazi regime's willingness to murder even the youngest and most vulnerable, contrasted with the extraordinary courage of those who risked their lives to save them. In the weeks following liberation, military authorities began the complex process of identifying the children and tracing any surviving family members. For many, there would be no reunions. Their entire families had been murdered in the Holocaust. These orphan survivors would face yet another challenge: rebuilding their lives in a post-war world that struggled to comprehend what they had endured. April 15 through 20th, 1945. Buchenwald Medical Facilities. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitaker of the U.S. Army Medical Corps stood in the center of what had been Block 46, Buchenwald's infamous medical experimentation facility. Around him, a team of American military doctors and forensic experts methodically documented every aspect of the building and its contents. "These appear to be records of the typhus experiments," said Major David Cohen, examining a stack of files the SS had failed to destroy in their hasty retreat. Patient histories, temperature charts, progression of symptoms, all documented with clinical precision. The American medical investigators had spent the past several days piecing together the evidence of Nazi medical crimes at Buchenwald. What they discovered painted a picture of systematic atrocity committed under the guise of scientific research. Since 1941, SS physicians at Buchenwald had conducted a program of involuntary human experimentation that resulted in hundreds of deaths. The primary focus had been infectious disease research, particularly typhus, but the program expanded to include other horrific studies. In one series of experiments, prisoners were deliberately infected with virulent strains of typhus to test vaccine efficacy. In another, prisoners' skin was deliberately burned with phosphorus taken from incendiary bombs to test treatment methods. "The phosphorus burn victims who survived are in Ward C," reported Captain Michael Ross, another medical officer. "The tissue damage is extensive. Many will require skin grafts and may never recover full function." The evidence revealed a clinical callousness that shocked even experienced military physicians. Test subjects were referred to by number rather than name. Their suffering was recorded in detached, scientific language. Failed treatments were noted dispassionately before moving on to the next experimental subject. Perhaps most disturbing were the detailed autopsy reports. When experimental subjects died, as many did, their bodies were meticulously dissected. Organs showing disease progression were preserved in formaldehyde for further study. Some remains had been sent to research institutions throughout Germany. Dr. Marcel Junot, a representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who arrived at Buchenwald on April 16th, later wrote, "What was most shocking was not just the cruelty, but the meticulous documentation of that cruelty. These were not the impulsive acts of sadists, though there was certainly sadism involved. These were calculated programs of experimentation on human beings who were viewed as less than human." American investigators also discovered evidence of other medical crimes. In 1944, Danish SS physician Karl Vernet had conducted a series of experiments claiming to cure homosexuality through hormonal implants. The procedures were painful, medically unsound, and completely ineffective, serving only to inflict additional suffering on prisoners already targeted for their sexual orientation. The medical facilities at Buchenwald also revealed evidence of more direct murder. Phenol injections to the heart, a method of rapid execution, had been administered to hundreds of prisoners deemed too ill to work or selected for elimination. The injections were often performed in the camp infirmary, perverting the medical setting from a place of healing to a site of execution. The American medical teams faced the dual challenge of documenting these crimes for future prosecution, while also providing emergency care to the thousands of survivors suffering from the effects of years of malnutrition, disease, and abuse. The 120th Evacuation Hospital Unit arrived at Buchenwald on April 15 to establish treatment facilities. Despite their extensive battlefield experience, many of the medical personnel were overwhelmed by what they encountered. Private Hence J. Hill, a medic with the 120th, wrote in a letter to his wife, "I was hauling desperately sick and dying prisoners, or what remained of once strong and healthy men, to the hospital. The sight of those near death was almost beyond belief. Thighs the size of my arm, buttocks no longer visible, pelvic bones seen at any angle, as were other human bones. The medical teams quickly learned that traditional approaches to treating the starving were dangerous. Initial attempts to provide normal food rations to survivors resulted in deaths from refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition caused by the rapid reintroduction of nutrition to severely malnourished patients. Specialized feeding protocols had to be developed, beginning with liquid nourishment before gradually introducing solid foods. Despite the best efforts of the medical teams, many survivors were simply too far gone to be saved. Between April 11 and May 1st, more than 400 liberated prisoners died from the effects of their imprisonment. Each death represented a final cruelty. Individuals who had survived years of Nazi persecution, only to die days or weeks after liberation. As the documentation of Buchenwald's medical crimes continued, Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker ensured that evidence was preserved for the war crimes trials that would follow. The meticulous records kept by the SS physicians, intended to advance their careers in the Nazi racial ideology, would instead serve as evidence of their crimes against humanity. April 16, 1945. The road from Weimar to Buchenwald. Colonel John Hendricks of the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division watched as the group of German civilians from Weimar walked slowly up the road toward Buchenwald. Approximately 1,000 residents of the city had been ordered to witness firsthand what had taken place just 8 kilometers from their homes. They claimed they didn't know, Hendricks told the military photographer beside him. Let's see if they still claim that after today. The decision to force local German civilians to tour the liberated concentration camps came directly from General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had visited the Ohrdruf camp, a Buchenwald subcamp, on April 12. Shocked by what he had seen, Eisenhower ordered that as many Germans as possible should be made to witness the atrocities committed in their name. Many of the Weimar residents approached Buchenwald with visible reluctance. Some openly expressed disbelief, insisting that the rumors of mass killings had been exaggerated. That disbelief would not survive the day's experience. At the camp entrance, they were met by Major William Cowling, who addressed them through an interpreter. You are about to see evidence of atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. You will walk through the entire camp. You will observe everything. Afterward, you will return to Weimar and tell others what you have seen. The tour began at the processing area, where new prisoners had been stripped of their possessions, clothing, and identity. It continued through the barracks, where thousands of emaciated survivors still remained, too weak to be moved to proper medical facilities. The German civilians were visibly shocked by the living conditions, the overcrowding, the lack of sanitation, the pervasive stench of disease and death. But it was at the crematorium that the most profound reactions occurred. Here, the evidence of mass murder was undeniable. Bodies that had not yet been cremated were stacked in piles. The ovens themselves contained human remains. Nearby stood containers filled with human ashes. Look closely, Major Cowling instructed them. This is what was done in your name, with your tacit acceptance. Many of the civilians broke down in tears. Some became physically ill. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Margareta Buber-Neumann, a former Buchenwald prisoner who had survived to witness the liberation, observed the German civilians' reactions. Now they weep, she remarked to an American officer. Where were their tears when the crematorium smoke rose day and night? When the trucks full of skeletal people arrived, they lived their comfortable lives and chose not to see. The German civilians were also shown the medical experimentation blocks and evidence of the pseudoscientific research conducted there. They saw the effect of starvation on the human body, with survivors weighing as little as 32 kilograms. They witnessed the mass graves, where thousands had been buried in anonymous pits. Colonel Hendricks ensured that photographers thoroughly documented this forced confrontation with reality. The resulting images, German civilians viewing piles of bodies, touring the crematorium, observing the surviving prisoners, would become powerful historical records of this moment of forced reckoning. Before they were allowed to return to Weimar, each civilian was required to sign a statement confirming what they had witnessed. These statements would later be distributed throughout the city as part of the denazification process. In the days following this initial forced tour, American military authorities ordered the mayor and his wife, along with other civic leaders from Weimar, to return to Buchenwald. They were instructed to bring clean sheets for the survivors, a symbolic act of minimal restitution for years of willful ignorance. This confrontation with the reality of Nazi atrocities marked the beginning of what would become known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the process of coming to terms with the past for the German population. For many of those who walked through Buchenwald that day, the experience shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of the regime they had lived under. As they departed, an American officer reminded them, "You will tell others what you saw here today. You will ensure that no one can say, 'We didn't know.'" April 20th through 30th, 1945, Buchenwald. Major Aaron Kleinman of the U.S. Army's War Crimes Documentation Unit arrived at Buchenwald on April 20th. His team's mission was clear: collect and preserve evidence of Nazi atrocities for future prosecution. What they found exceeded even their worst expectations. "We need sworn statements from survivors, photographic evidence, physical artifacts, and German documentation," Kleinman instructed his team. "This evidence needs to be unimpeachable. The world must know what happened here." The documentation process faced immediate challenges. Many survivors were too weak to provide detailed testimony. Others struggled with the psychological trauma of recounting their experiences. Language barriers complicated interviews, requiring translators for the dozens of nationalities represented among the prisoners. Despite these obstacles, Kleinman's team began systematically recording survivor testimonies. Former prisoner Walter Bartel, who had led the camp's underground resistance, provided crucial information about the camp's administrative structure and the SS personnel who had operated it. "Each block had an SS block leader," Bartel explained. "They conducted daily selections, determined work assignments, and meted out punishments. Most were deliberately cruel, some were sadistic. All were complicit in mass murder." French prisoner Marcel Paul described the system of forced labor that had worked thousands to death in the armaments factories surrounding Buchenwald. Soviet POWs detailed the special brutality reserved for Russian prisoners, who were often worked to death in the stone quarry, a fate considered among the worst possible assignments in Buchenwald. The evidence of medical crimes proved especially important. Dr. Eugene Oost, a Belgian physician who had been forced to assist in the camp hospital, provided detailed testimony about the deliberate malpractice and experimental atrocities committed by SS doctors. "They viewed prisoners as laboratory specimens," Oost testified. "They induced diseases, inflicted injuries, and documented the results with scientific precision. These were not medical experiments in any legitimate sense. They were torture, conducted under the guise of research." American military photographers and filmmakers documented every aspect of the camp. Their images captured the living conditions, the physical state of survivors, the crematorium facilities, and the mass graves. These visual records would later prove vital in countering denial of Nazi atrocities. The documentation team also recovered thousands of pages of German records that the SS had failed to destroy in their hasty retreat. These included transport lists, death registers, medical experimentation records, and administrative correspondence. Together, they painted a picture of bureaucratized murder, a system designed to process human beings as expendable material. Perhaps the most important documentation came from the prisoners themselves. Throughout the years of their imprisonment, members of the resistance had maintained secret records. Names of perpetrators, dates of mass killings, details of medical experiments, all had been recorded and hidden, awaiting liberation. Zbigniew Lukaszynski, a Polish political prisoner who had worked as a clerk in the camp office, had systematically copied SS documents for years, creating a parallel archive of evidence. This archive included the names of every SS officer who had served at Buchenwald, along with details of their specific crimes. "I memorized faces, names, ranks," Lukasinski explained to Major Kleinman. "I recorded who gave which orders, who conducted selections, who participated in executions. They thought no one would survive to testify against them. They were wrong." On April 24, 1945, two American investigators, Egon Fleck and First Lieutenant Edward Tenenbaum, compiled Buchenwald, a preliminary report, one of the first official American documents detailing the atrocities discovered at the camp. This report would help shape the Allied understanding of the concentration camp system and inform the subsequent war crimes trials. As the documentation process continued, the survivors of Buchenwald began to consider how they would memorialize their experiences and honor those who had not lived to see liberation. On April 19, just 8 days after liberation, former prisoners held the first memorial service for the dead of Buchenwald. During this ceremony, survivors from 18 countries took what would become known as the Buchenwald Oath. "We will take up the fight until the last culprit stands before the judges of the people. Our watchword is the destruction of Nazism from its roots. Our goal is to build a new world of peace and freedom." This oath, with its commitment both to justice and to building a better future, represented the determination of survivors to ensure that their suffering would lead to meaningful change. The evidence they helped compile would indeed be used at the subsequent Nuremberg trials, where many of the perpetrators of Buchenwald's atrocities would face justice. For Major Kleinman and his documentation team, the work at Buchenwald was both professionally crucial and personally devastating. As he wrote in his final report, "What we have documented here transcends ordinary criminality. It represents a fundamental assault on the very concept of humanity. The evidence we have gathered must serve not only judicial purposes, but also as a permanent record for future generations." April 11, 1995, Buchenwald Memorial, Germany. 50 years after the liberation of Buchenwald, survivors gathered once more on the grounds where they had experienced the darkest chapter of human history. Now elderly, their numbers diminished by time, they came to bear witness once more, not only to the horror they had endured, but to their enduring resilience. Among them was Elie Wiesel, who had survived Buchenwald as a teenager and gone on to become one of the most powerful voices of Holocaust remembrance. Addressing the gathered survivors, dignitaries, and media, he spoke words that captured both the historical significance of Buchenwald and its contemporary relevance. "We believed that Buchenwald and Dachau, Auschwitz and Treblinka would serve as warnings. But look at Bosnia, look at Rwanda, look at Sudan. Ethnic hatreds are still being played out in blood. The work of remembrance is unfinished." In the decades since liberation, Buchenwald had undergone many transformations. From 1945 to 1950, Soviet occupation forces used the site as an internment camp for Nazis and others deemed threats to the new order. Later, under the East German government, Buchenwald became a national memorial, its history framed through the lens of communist resistance to fascism. After German reunification in 1990, the memorial was redesigned to provide a more comprehensive historical accounting. The stories that had been marginalized in previous eras, those of Jewish victims, Roma and Sinti prisoners, homosexuals, and others targeted by Nazi persecution, were given proper recognition alongside the narrative of political resistance. By 1995, the physical evidence of Buchenwald's horrors had been partially reclaimed by nature. Grass grew where once there was only mud. Trees had matured along the paths where death marches began. The crematorium stood as a preserved reminder, but much of the camp had been dismantled, with only foundations remaining to mark where barracks once stood. Yet the documentary evidence gathered in those crucial weeks after liberation remained intact. Thousands of photographs, films, testimonies, and German records preserved in archives around the world. Together with the survivors' own accounts, they ensured that what happened at Buchenwald would not be forgotten or denied. The story of Buchenwald encompasses both the darkest and most inspiring aspects of human capability: the capacity for systematic cruelty and the resilience of those who maintain their humanity under unimaginable circumstances. It reminds us of how easily civilization can collapse when hatred is legitimized and persecution normalized. Most importantly, it stands as evidence of what happens when the world turns away from atrocity, and what can be achieved when individuals choose resistance, even against overwhelming odds. The liberation of Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, marked not only the freedom of 21,000 prisoners, but also the beginning of a long process of reckoning with the Holocaust. That process continues today, as new generations confront the questions raised by sites like Buchenwald. How could this happen? What allowed ordinary people to become complicit in mass murder? What responsibility do we bear to recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time? For the survivors who returned to Buchenwald 50 years later, these questions remained urgent. The oath they had taken in April 1945 to fight for a world of peace and freedom represented a commitment not just to remember the past, but to actively shape a more humane future. In his final remarks at the 50th anniversary commemoration, Elie Wiesel addressed not just those present, but generations to come. When the last survivor is gone, let the memory of Buchenwald continue to teach and warn. What happened here was not inevitable. It was the result of choices. Choices to hate. Choices to remain silent. Choices to look away. Different choices can still be made. The clock at Buchenwald's entrance remains fixed at 3:15 p.m. The moment of liberation on April 11, 1945. But the obligation to remember, to understand, and to prevent similar atrocities continues without end.